The wind carried the smell of dry pine and distant rain as she walked the narrow trail back toward her small cabin at the edge of the frontier. Life out here was lonely, but she preferred it that way. Folks in town talked too much and listened too little. Out here on the open land, she felt she could breathe without anyone watching her every move. She had built this simple place with her own hands, set between tall cottonwoods on one side and a quiet creek on the other. Most days were peaceful, but lately something in the air felt heavier, the way the sky feels right before a storm. She had no idea that the events of one evening in town were about to change her life in ways she could not imagine. The trouble had started the moment she stepped into the dusty main street the day before. She had only planned on buying flour, a few candles, and maybe some coffee if prices had not risen again. She was tying her horse near the trading post when she noticed a crowd gathering in front of the sheriff's office. At first, she ignored it, thinking it was just another argument or a drunk who had caused a scene. But then she heard angry voices, sharp and tense. Something inside her pushed her feet toward the commotion. 2 deputies had a young Apache boy pinned against the wall. His hands were tied and his lip was bleeding. He looked barely 16, maybe younger. The deputies were shouting at him as if he were some wild animal. One pushed his shoulder into the boy's chest while the other struck him across the face for no reason other than having power over someone weaker. People stood around watching but did nothing, their eyes shifting away like they hoped no one would notice their silence. She felt her stomach twist. She knew the fear and prejudice that ran through towns like this. Ever since the tension between settlers and tribes grew, folks acted as though every Apache was a threat. But she had lived near their lands long enough to know most of them just wanted peace. The young boy looked scared more than anything. He didn't fight back, didn't speak, didn't even lift his head. That broke something inside her. She had never been the type to step into trouble, but the sight of him pushed her forward before her mind could stop her. She walked straight toward the deputies and told them to let the boy go. She kept her voice steady even though her heart pounded hard. The deputies turned to her with disbelief, as if they couldn't understand why a woman who lived alone on the frontier would care about an Apache. They told her to step aside, that it wasn't her business, that the boy had probably stolen something. But when she asked what exactly he had taken, they didn't answer. They only tightened their grip on him. Something in their eyes told her this wasn't about justice. It was about showing power. She stood between them and the boy, and even though they shouted at her, she didn't move. She said they had no right to beat someone who couldn't defend himself. The moment stretched on, gathering the kind of silence that feels sharp enough to cut. Then one of the deputies let out a curse and reluctantly stepped back. The other lowered his hand, annoyed but unsure of his next move with the whole crowd watching. She untied the rope around the boy's wrists and helped him stand. His legs shook slightly, but he kept his gaze lowered. She told him he was safe and asked if he understood her. He nodded once. She didn't try to touch him or speak too quickly. She knew he might be frightened. The deputies grumbled about the trouble she had caused and walked away. The crowd slowly scattered, most pretending they had somewhere else to be. She led the boy toward the edge of town, and for the first time he looked at her with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. She asked where his family was. He pointed east toward the distant mesas. She didn't know how far he had traveled or what hardship had brought him into town alone. She gave him a small piece of bread from her bag and told him he could rest near the creek before heading home. He accepted quietly, still wary, but he didn't run. When she turned to leave, she felt his eyes on her, like he couldn't believe someone had stepped in for him. She didn't think it was a big gesture. It was simply the right thing to do. She rode back to her cabin thinking the matter was done. But the strange feeling in the air never faded. That night she kept waking up, listening to the quiet forest with a kind of alertness she couldn't explain. She told herself it was only her nerves after the confrontation. People in town had looked at her differently as she left, some whispering, some frowning. She knew she'd hear about it the next time she came in. She didn't care. Still, something unsettled her. Like a distant drumbeat she could almost hear but not fully understand the next morning. The sky was heavy with clouds, but the air stayed hot. She stepped outside, planning to fetch water from the creek and check her small vegetable patch. But the land felt too still. The birds stayed quiet, the wind held its breath. She paused, listening. Then she noticed movement far beyond the tree line. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But then the shapes became clearer. Riders, many of them, moving through the forest with careful steps. Her heartbeat quickened, but she didn't run inside. She stood still, counting as the figures continued to appear. Their horses moved in disciplined silence. Feathers, braids, painted shields, long dark hair. She recognized the riders immediately. Apache warriors. Not 2 or 3. Not a small group scouting the area. She counted more and more until the number made her breath catch. They didn't stop at the edge of the trees. They kept coming, moving toward her cabin as if the land itself belonged to them, and she was simply standing in the middle of their path. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to raise her hands or stand firm. The stillness thickened as the first riders drew near. Then she saw the young Apache boy among them, sitting straight on his horse, looking at her with calm eyes. He said nothing, but the warriors around him watched her with intensity. Their expressions unreadable. She didn't know if they had come to thank her, or question her, or accuse her of something she didn't understand. She didn't know if they believed she had helped him or harmed him. She didn't know why they had come in such a large number. One thing was certain. Whatever had happened in town had reached the tribe faster than she expected. And now 176 Apache warriors stood outside her cabin, their presence filling the land with a tension that felt ready to snap. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as the leading rider stepped forward. His shadow stretched across the ground toward her boots. He looked like a man who carried the weight of decisions that could shape the future of his people. His eyes held a question she wasn't prepared to answer. She opened her mouth to speak, unsure what words to even choose, unsure if a single sentence could change what might happen next. Before she could say anything, he lifted his hand. The warriors behind him fell silent in perfect unison. The entire world seemed to pause. And in that stillness, she realized that whatever came next would alter not only her own life, but the fragile peace of the frontier. She had acted with kindness, but she had no idea what price kindness might demand now. She felt the stillness thicken as the leading rider's eyes settled on her. There was no anger in his expression, but there was no calm either. It was something in between, something she couldn't read. His face carried the weight of years spent making decisions for people who depended on him. Behind him, the others sat quietly on their horses, their straight backs and steady eyes showing discipline she had always respected. She knew enough about the Apache to understand they rarely traveled in a group this large unless something serious had happened. The presence of 176 warriors told her this moment was not ordinary. It was a message, one she didn't yet understand. She kept her hands loose at her sides, not wanting to show fear, but not wanting to appear challenging either. The young Apache boy she had defended the day before watched her from his saddle. There was no pain in his face now. Instead, there was something like expectation. She wondered what he had told them about her. She wondered whether he had even spoken at all, or if his clan had understood everything the moment they saw his bruised cheek. The frontier had a way of moving news faster than any rider. The leading rider lowered his hand slowly. He studied her as if trying to decide whether she was a threat or simply a woman who had stepped into someone else's fight. She felt the weight of his gaze but kept her feet planted. Running or backing away would only make things worse. She stayed still and waited for whatever he wanted to say. But he didn't speak. Instead, he nodded to the boy. The young Apache slid off his horse and walked toward her. His steps were steady, not hesitant like they had been the day before. He stopped a few paces away and stood silently. She could tell he wanted to explain something but wasn't sure how. So she spoke first. She told him he was safe, that the deputies hadn't followed him, that no one would hurt him here. He listened closely, then turned to the leading rider and spoke in his own language. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was calm. The leading rider's expression softened just slightly. Though his eyes stayed sharp, more riders stepped forward, forming a loose half-circle in front of her cabin. Their presence made the small clearing feel smaller than ever. She realized they hadn't come to threaten her. They had come because the young boy was important to them. Maybe he was related to someone powerful within the tribe. Maybe he had been on an important journey when the deputies grabbed him. Whatever the reason, the tribe had responded in a way that showed unity and pride. Her cabin suddenly felt unprepared for this moment. It was small and simple, built from logs she had carried and shaped herself. Her life here had always been quiet. She kept to herself, growing a small garden, fishing from the creek, and occasionally riding into town for supplies. She avoided gossip and never caused trouble. She had chosen this life to escape the noise of her past, a past that still haunted her in quiet moments. She didn't talk about where she came from or why she lived alone. The land helped her stay grounded and honest, something she had lost before coming here. She remembered her first months on this land, when she found an Apache woman injured near the creek. She had helped her without hesitation, patching a cut on her arm and giving her water. The woman had left quietly the next morning, but she had returned days later with fresh berries as a gesture of gratitude. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood each other in the silence. After that, other Apache women occasionally passed by her cabin, leaving small woven baskets or dried herbs. She never saw them leave, but the gifts always appeared near the door. She felt those quiet exchanges had created a bridge of trust. But trust on the frontier was delicate, and one mistake could break it. The leading rider dismounted slowly. Standing on the ground, he seemed taller, the kind of man who carried his authority naturally. He walked toward her with calm steps. She felt her breath tighten, but she didn't step back. When he stopped in front of her, the young Apache boy stood between them, facing the leader. The boy pointed at her cabin, then at her, then made a gesture she didn't understand. It looked like he was explaining what had happened, the way she had defended him, the way she had stood against the deputies. The leading rider listened, his eyes shifting between the boy and her. After the boy finished speaking, the rider looked at her directly. His voice was deep and steady when he finally spoke in English. He thanked her for defending the boy. His words were few, carried with restraint, but they carried weight. She nodded and said she only did what anyone should do. But he shook his head slightly as if disagreeing with her. He told her most people would have stayed quiet. She felt the truth of that statement settle heavy in the air. The town's silence still echoed in her mind. She had stepped forward because she couldn't stomach injustice. It wasn't heroism. It was instinct. But on the frontier, small acts carried long shadows. She realized then that her actions had reached further than she expected. The tribe had come not just to acknowledge her gesture, but to understand her and decide whether her presence near their land was a threat or an ally. He asked her why she lived alone. The question cut unexpectedly deep. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Her past was full of things she didn't like remembering. Years ago, she had traveled west with her family, hoping for a new start. But sickness had taken her parents, and her brother had left to chase work in distant towns, leaving her with little more than a wagon and a will to survive. She had built her cabin because she needed a place that didn't remind her of loss. A place where she could think without the noise of the world pressing in. She explained some of this to the leader, keeping her voice steady even as old memories stirred behind her words. He listened without interrupting. She got the sense he understood more than he let on. The Apache knew hardship better than most. They lived close to the land and fought to protect every piece of it. He seemed to respect the honesty in her story. But respect didn't ease the tension. The air remained tight. The riders behind him kept their eyes fixed on her, watching every small movement. She understood why. A single wrong word or gesture could turn misunderstanding into conflict. The frontier was stitched together with uneasy agreements, and she had stepped into the middle of something larger than herself. He asked about the deputies. His voice hardened slightly when he spoke of them. She explained how they had accused the boy without proof, how they had hit him, how she had stepped in. She didn't exaggerate or soften anything. She spoke plainly, knowing that honesty was her only chance of keeping peace. The leader nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. The boy looked at her with quiet gratitude. but she could also see a shadow of anger in him. Not toward her, but toward the injustice he had faced. The leader stepped back and spoke to the warriors in their own language. Their expressions changed subtly, some nodding, others narrowing their eyes. He instructed a group of riders to check the boy's injuries again and make sure he could travel. She watched them work with precision, using herbs and careful hands. It reminded her of the Apache woman she had helped years ago. Their ways were different, but their care was gentle and methodical. As they worked, the leader remained near her cabin, occasionally watching her. She felt as if he was trying to see if she held any hidden intentions. She had nothing to hide, but even so, being studied that closely made her uneasy. She kept her posture calm and steady, reminding herself that fear would only worsen the situation. The young Apache returned to her and handed her a small woven charm made from grass and thin strips of bark. He placed it in her palm gently. She didn't know its meaning, but she understood it was important. Before she could ask anything, the leader told her it was a sign of gratitude from the boy's family. It also meant she was under their watch now. Not as an enemy, but as someone whose future actions mattered deeply. She held the charm carefully. The weight of it felt like a promise she wasn't sure she knew how to keep. Her small cabin suddenly felt too fragile to hold the expectations of an entire tribe. Yet she stood firm, because running would break whatever fragile trust existed now. The leader looked toward the horizon, then back at her. He said the land was changing. Tensions between settlers and tribes were rising faster than anyone could stop. What happened in town might be only the beginning. And because she had stepped into the path of that trouble, she was now part of it whether she liked it or not. A cold wind cut through the stillness, scattering leaves across the clearing. The warrior shifted, sensing the movement as something more than weather. She felt it too, like a warning carried by the land itself. The leader's next words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wind. He said the deputies would not forget being challenged, and the next time they acted, they wouldn't be alone. He watched her, waiting for her reaction. She swallowed hard, understanding the danger that now pressed in from two sides. She realized her life on the quiet frontier had changed forever, and the path ahead was filled with uncertainty before she could respond. Distant hoofbeats echoed from the far ridge, faint but unmistakable. The leader turned sharply. The warrior straightened. The boy stepped closer to her as if bracing for whatever came next, and in that moment, she sensed everything was about to shift again. The hoofbeats from the ridge grew clearer. No longer a distant echo, but a steady drum along the dry ground. The Apache warriors shifted in their saddles, hands resting near rifles and bows, eyes fixed on the horizon. The young boy stepped even closer to her porch, as if the small cabin offered some kind of shelter from what was coming. She felt her throat tighten. The leader lifted his chin toward the ridge, reading the sound the way some men read books. He did not look surprised. It was as if he had been expecting this. 4 riders appeared on the rise, then 2 more behind them. Sunlight flashed off rifles and the tin star pinned to one chest. She recognized the sheriff even at a distance, broad shoulders, stiff posture, the way he sat in the saddle like a man convinced the land belonged to him alone. Beside him rode the same deputy who had struck the young Apache in town. The man's jaw was set tight, his eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the warriors gathered around her cabin. The air between the two groups felt like a piece of rope pulled from both ends, ready to snap. The sheriff slowed as he neared the clearing, raising one hand to signal his riders to hold. Their horses tossed their heads, uneasy with the thick tension. The sheriff's gaze swept across the scene, counting numbers, measuring distance, weighing risk. He saw her standing on the porch, the leader near her, the young Apache boy at her side. For a moment his expression flickered with something like disbelief. Then it hardened into something colder. He called out to her using the same steady voice he used in town when giving orders. He asked what she thought she was doing. He told her she had no right to harbor Apache near her home, that she was putting herself in danger. But his tone made clear he was less worried for her safety and more worried about his control slipping. He said the boy had been resisting arrest, that the deputies had been within their rights. She felt anger rise again at the lie. The memory of the boy pressed against the wall, tied and bleeding, burned in her mind. Before she could answer, the Apache leader stepped forward. His presence alone drew the sheriff's attention. The leader spoke calmly, telling the sheriff that the boy had done nothing wrong, that he had gone into town to trade, not to steal. He said the beating had been an insult not only to the boy, but to the entire tribe. His words were even, but the meaning behind them was sharp. The sheriff understood. So did the riders behind him. One of them shifted nervously in the saddle, glancing between the two sides as if wishing he was anywhere else. She watched the deputy from the day before. His name was Wade. She knew that because she had heard someone call him that in the saloon once. Wade had always been quick to anger, quicker to reach for his gun. Now his eyes burned with something that looked like wounded pride. He stared at the young Apache boy as if still trying to prove something. To himself? To the sheriff? To the town? Maybe even to the fear he carried. Wade muttered that they should have locked the boy up when they had the chance. The sheriff shot him a warning look, but did not completely disagree. The frontier law in this old American town was not written in books as much as it was carved into faces, into land, into memories. The sheriff represented the settlers. The Apache leader represented his people. And somehow, she had become the fragile plank of wood laid between two cliffs. She stepped down from the porch, standing where both sides could see her clearly. She explained, slowly and clearly, what had happened in town. She said the boy had never raised a hand against them, that he was struck while tied. She said anyone with eyes could see it had not been justice but cruelty. The words hung in the air. Some of the riders shifted, unable to look directly at her. The sheriff studied her with a long, measured gaze, as if deciding whether to call her a liar in front of so many witnesses. He finally said she had overstepped, that she had no authority to interfere with an arrest, that by sheltering the tribe near her cabin, she made herself part of their dispute. He warned her that the town would not look kindly on what she had done. Her actions, he said, made settler families feel unsafe. He spoke about cattle raids, about stolen horses, about burned wagons. Old stories were pulled out like tools used to feed fear. The Apache leader did not stay silent. He answered each claim, reminding the sheriff how often his people had been blamed without proof. He spoke of promises broken by men who rode under flags and stars, of land taken without agreement, of families pushed from water and hunting trails. He did not raise his voice, but each word seemed anchored in years of frustration. The warriors behind him listened with steady faces, as if they had heard these arguments many times before. She realized then that this moment was not just about a single beating or a single act of kindness. It was about years of mistrust, about the way the frontier pitted neighbor against neighbor, tribe against settler, law against conscience. She felt small in the middle of it, yet she also felt responsible in a way she had never expected. She had stepped into the fight when she defended the boy. Now the fight had followed her home. A rider near the back of the sheriff's group pushed his horse slightly forward. He was younger than the others, with softer eyes and hands that did not sit easy near his gun. She recognized him as the son of a ranching family a few miles from town. He had once bought seeds from her when he passed by with his father. Now he looked troubled, caught between loyalty to the sheriff and the sight of one woman facing a line of armed men and warriors. He asked the sheriff, in a careful voice, what good would come from starting a fight here. He pointed out the numbers. 176 Apache against 6 riders. Even with rifles, the odds were poor. The sheriff glared at him but did not deny the truth. Slowly, the sheriff lowered his hand from his gun. He was not a fool. He knew this was not the place to press for blood, but retreat would make him look weak in the eyes of the town. And weakness could cost him his badge and his standing dot, so he chose another path. He announced loudly that he would not start a war at a woman's cabin, but the matter was not over. He said he would send word to the army post. He would ask for soldiers, for proper authority. He would return with a warrant, with more men, with written law backing his demands. He pointed at her and said she would have to answer for aiding people who resisted arrest. His words were cold, but he delivered them with a sense of certainty that made her skin prickle. When he turned his horse, Wade hesitated. His hand twitched near his revolver as he looked at the boy. For a second, she saw something wild and reckless in his eyes, the impulse to act out of anger instead of sense. The Apache leader noticed too. His hand brushed the grip of his rifle. The clearing tensed. One wrong move and the quiet creek in cottonwoods would be stained with something that never truly washed away. The younger rider laid a hand on Wade's arm and shook his head slightly. Something in that small gesture reached Wade where reason had failed. He looked away, cursed it under his breath, and finally followed the sheriff. The riders pulled back in a slow, controlled line, their silhouettes shrinking as they rode toward town. Yet their departure did not bring peace. It brought a heavier silence, full of promises that felt like storms waiting over the mountains. The Apache leader watched them leave, eyes narrowed. He knew the threat of soldiers was not an empty one. Many times soldiers had come to force tribes from their lands, calling it peacekeeping, calling it progress. The leader turned to her and said the sheriff would not forget this day, nor would the town. He said the army would not care about the truth of what happened on that dusty street or in front of this cabin. They would care only about reports, claims, and orders. She looked around at her small home. The cabin had once been a place of refuge, built from quiet effort and stubborn hope. Now it felt like a marker on a map, a point of friction between two worlds. The woven charm in her hand felt heavier with each passing moment. It was not only a sign of gratitude. It was a rope tying her fate to the tribe's struggle. The leader told her they would not camp long near her cabin. To do so would draw trouble straight to her doorstep. Yet he also said they could not ignore what the sheriff planned. The tribe had to decide how to respond before soldiers arrived. Some of the warriors urged him to strike first, to ride into town and demand justice before reinforcements came. Others argued for moving the camp deeper into the hills, watching and waiting. Their voices, though calm, carried sharp edges. The young Apache boy remained near her, quiet but alert. In his eyes she saw something she recognized from her own reflection many nights. The look of someone caught between fear and resolve. She wondered what the beating in town had done to him, not just to his body but to his spirit. He had seen men with badges treat him as less than human. He had also seen a stranger risk herself for him. Those two images would shape the way he saw this land for the rest of his life. As the warriors argued softly in their own language, she stepped aside and looked toward the trail leading to town. She thought of the general store owner who had once given her an extra sack of flour during a lean winter. She thought of the town's teacher who had spoken gently of peace whenever others shouted for force. Not everyone in town wanted war, but fear could push good people to follow bad choices. She knew that well. She had seen it back east when mobs formed and reason vanished. The conflict around her was no longer only between Apache and deputies. It was between fear and courage, revenge and restraint, pride and survival. Her own part in it remained unclear. Was she supposed to stand firm at her cabin, refusing to yield to pressure from either side? Or ride into town and speak to the handful of folks who still listened before decisions hardened into orders? Or travel with the tribe for a time, learning their side of the story in full before choosing her path? The Apache leader walked back to her porch and asked quietly if she understood the danger ahead. She said she did. He studied her for a long moment, then said something that caught her breath. He told her that by defending the boy in town, she had stepped across a line that could not be unseen. To the sheriff, she now belonged closer to the Apache than to the settlers. To the tribe, she had shown a heart that might stand with them when the wind turned cruel. He said every person on this land would soon have to decide where they stood when the soldiers came. Silence would no longer be an option. The frontier was changing, and those changes would not wait for anyone to be ready. The sun dipped slightly behind the trees, throwing longer shadows across the clearing. The warriors began to move, some riding to scout the ridges, others circling the cabin's edge as if measuring its defenses. The sound of their horses mingled with the distant faint echo of the riders heading back to town. Two worlds turning in opposite directions, both drawing closer to a point they could not avoid. She stood between them, The woven charm resting in her hand, the sheriff's threat ringing in her ears, and the leader's warning resting heavy on her heart, knowing that the next choice she made could pull everything tighter or finally cause the rope to tear. The clearing around her cabin stayed tense long after the sheriff and his riders disappeared into the distance. The Apache warriors moved with sharp awareness, scanning the tree line, listening for anything out of place. The leader spoke quietly to several riders, sending them toward the hills and others toward the creek. Each one left with purpose, their silhouettes slipping into the forest like shadows. She watched them work in silence, feeling the weight of their worry and the weight of her own. The young Apache boy stayed near her cabin door, glancing toward the trail every now and then. His eyes carried a mixture of anger and fear, but also a new steadiness. Whatever he had gone through in town had changed him, but so had standing among his people again. When he caught her watching him, he straightened his posture a little, as if he didn't want her to think he was afraid. She offered him a soft smile, and he bowed his head slightly. A small gesture of respect she hadn't expected. The leader approached her again. He said they couldn't stay long, not with the sheriff threatening soldiers, but they also couldn't leave too quickly. The tribe needed to decide what to do. If they moved deeper into the hills, the sheriff would claim they were hiding to plan an attack. If they stayed, the soldiers would surround the valley before anyone could speak a word of peace. Every option looked dangerous. The leader asked her if she understood the storm that was coming. She nodded, though the truth was she didn't know if anyone could fully understand what was about to unfold. As afternoon faded, more riders returned with reports. One had seen dust trails far off near the main road, meaning someone was riding fast from town. Another said the trading post seemed closed earlier than usual. Another said a settler family had packed their wagon and headed toward the army post. These little details formed a larger picture, one that made her stomach twist tighter. It meant word was spreading quickly. Fear traveled faster than horses. The leader lowered his voice and told her. The tribe believed the sheriff would return with 20 or 30 armed men. Maybe more if he convinced neighboring ranchers to join him. The people in town were scared, and scared people followed the loudest voice. He said the tribe had no plan to attack unless attacked first, but the sheriff would say otherwise to gain support. She felt her breath catch. This land she had lived on quietly for so long was now becoming the stage for a conflict larger than her cabin. Larger even than the boy's beating. A few of the warriors glanced at her with caution. They respected the boy's gratitude toward her, but didn't fully trust a settler, no matter how kind she had been. She didn't blame them. Trust on the frontier was rare, especially between people divided by years of hurt. She stayed calm, showing no sign of fear. The best way she could help was by not becoming another source of worry for them. The leader gathered his closest riders beneath the cottonwoods. She stood a short distance away, not wanting to intrude but also unwilling to return inside her cabin when the fate of everything around her hung by a thread. The group discussed how to defend themselves if things turned violent, but the leader insisted again they should not strike first. They argued quietly but passionately. Some said the soldiers would come anyway, so better to show strength now. Others said showing strength too soon would only fuel the sheriff's story. She realized then that this was the heart of the conflict. Both sides believed they were protecting their way of life. Both sides believed they had been pushed enough. And both sides believed the next move determined the future of the valley. It wasn't about who was right. It was about who was desperate enough to act first. The sky slowly shifted into deeper orange as the sun sank behind the hills. She felt a strange chill even though the air stayed warm. She decided she needed to do something. Standing still would only let the storm grow stronger. She walked to the leader and told him she wanted to speak to the town before soldiers were alerted. She said there were still good people there, people who didn't want violence. If she could reach them first, maybe the sheriff's plan would weaken. But the leader disagreed. He said if she rode into town now, the sheriff would accuse her of spying for the Apache. He might lock her up or worse. She argued gently, saying the town knew her well enough to listen. But the leader reminded her that fear had changed many minds overnight. Still, she felt a pull inside her, stronger than caution. If she didn't try, she would regret it forever. She told the leader she understood the risk, but some risks had to be taken to prevent greater harm. The leader studied her face, searching for doubt. When he found none, he sighed. He said if she insisted, she wouldn't go alone. He pointed to the young Apache boy. The boy straightened with surprise. The leader said the boy would guide her through the woods, away from the main road, so she could approach the town from an angle that avoided the sheriff's patrols. The boy nodded quickly, eager to help. She felt a heaviness lift, even if only a little. The leader placed a hand on her shoulder just long enough to show respect. He said if she didn't return by the next sunrise, they would consider her captured and would act accordingly. His words weren't a threat, but a statement of the reality they all faced. Dusk fell fast. The world turned deep purple as the last light faded behind the peaks. She saddled her horse and tied a small satchel of water and bread to the back. The young Apache boy mounted his horse with smooth confidence, glancing at her to confirm she was ready. She wasn't, but waiting longer wouldn't make her more prepared. They rode quietly into the trees, guided by the faint glow of the sky above. The forest hummed softly with its night sounds, but every crack of a branch made her tense. The boy pointed out safe paths and warned her of steep drops and rocky slopes. His presence steadied her. She could see why the leader trusted him despite his youth. He moved with patience, with awareness. He also kept checking behind them, making sure no riders followed Dot as they neared the outskirts of town. She saw the faint flicker of lanterns. More lanterns than usual. The boy halted and waited. She listened. Voices, many of them, echoed from the streets. Men shouting. Horses restless. The town was awake, and not from celebration. The sheriff must have told them he was forming a group to confront the tribe. She heard someone mention the army post. Her pulse quickened. The boy dismounted and motioned for her to follow him on foot through a narrow path behind the blacksmith's shop. The town felt different, heavier, coiled like a spring. She peeked around the edge of a building and saw the sheriff standing near the saloon, talking loudly as a crowd gathered. He spoke of danger, of Apache gathering in large numbers, of threats to the valley. Every word stirred fear. People nodded, some reluctantly, some eagerly. She recognized the teacher from the schoolhouse standing near the back, worry etched across her face. She spotted the young rancher who had tried to reason with the sheriff earlier. He looked torn, caught between two responsibilities he didn't know how to balance. She stepped forward, ready to speak, but the boy grabbed her sleeve gently. He shook his head and pointed. 2 deputies were walking the perimeter, checking shadows. They were looking for anyone hiding or sneaking. She realized that if she stepped into the open, they might not listen at all. She needed to choose her words carefully and her moment even more carefully. She leaned closer to hear the sheriff's plan. He said at dawn they would ride out armed. If the Apache didn't leave peacefully, they would force them from the valley. He told the crowd that letting the tribe stay would only lead to danger for settlers and families. He said she was helping them, that she was blind to the threat. He painted her as reckless and misguided. Someone in the crowd muttered that she had always been too soft on outsiders. Her stomach twisted. This was worse than she expected. She had become part of the story the sheriff was spinning. He wasn't just turning the town against the Apache. He was turning them against her. The boy looked at her with concern. She whispered that she still had to try. If she stayed hidden, nothing would change. The teacher stepped forward and challenged the sheriff, saying he didn't have proof of any threat. Others murmured agreement. A small ripple of resistance. It wasn't enough to stop him, but enough to show the town wasn't united in fear. This gave her a sliver of hope. She waited until the deputies walked farther down the street, then stepped out of the shadows and called the sheriff's name. Every head turned. The sheriff narrowed his eyes, surprised she had come. Shouts rose in confusion. She walked closer, hands open at her sides, showing she carried no weapon. The boy stayed hidden behind the buildings as she had asked. She told the sheriff he was lying about the boy resisting. She told the town that the Apache had not come to attack but to retrieve their injured youth. She spoke about the tribe's restraint and the danger of rushing into violence. Some listened with uncertainty. Others frowned. The sheriff lifted his chin, ready to challenge every word she said. But before he could speak, a deputy ran up breathless. He said soldiers had been spotted near the western ridge. They were already on the way toward the valley, the crowd gasped. She felt her heart drop. The sheriff's confident expression grew sharper, almost triumphant. He said it was a sign that the government agreed with him. But she saw the truth. She saw it in the eyes of the teacher and the young rancher. The soldiers weren't coming to bring peace. They were coming because fear had been sparked and now burned uncontrolled. The boy stepped out of hiding at that moment, his small figure illuminated by lantern light. The crowd froze as he approached her. The sheriff reached for his gun. She stepped in front of the boy fast. The tension snapped like a pulled string before anyone could move further. The soldiers' horns echoed from the ridge, a low warning sound that rolled across the valley. The sheriff's riders scrambled for their horses. The townsfolk rushed to gather supplies. Panic spread faster than fire. The boy looked up at her with fear, asking silently what to do next. She grabbed his arm gently and whispered that they needed to get back to the leader before the soldiers surrounded the valley. The boy nodded. They ran toward their horses hidden near the trees. Behind them, lanterns swung wildly, voices rose, guns clattered. The town was racing toward conflict, not away from it. The ridge lights flickered as soldiers advanced. The valley felt smaller, the air heavier. She knew this was the moment everything was leading toward. The moment where choices mattered most. Her heart pounded as she and the boy rode into the dark woods, racing against time. She didn't know if they would reach the tribe in time, but she knew one thing. The last hope for peace was now in their hands. They rode through the dark woods with only the thin light of the rising moon between the branches. The horses breathed hard, hooves thudding against the soft ground. She leaned low over the saddle, urging her horse to move faster, while the young Apache boy rode beside her with fierce determination. Every sound behind them made her fear the soldiers had changed their route and cut through the woods. She kept glancing back, but only saw the shifting shadows of trees dot as they reached the open stretch near her cabin. She saw faint glimmers of torchlight. The Apache warriors were still awake, alert and ready. The leader stood near the clearing, waiting for news. When the boy and she burst through the tree line, he stepped forward quickly. The warriors tensed, hands near weapons, until they recognized them. Relief swept through the group. But it vanished quickly when she explained what she had seen. She told the leader the sheriff had twisted the truth, rallying townspeople with fear. She told him soldiers were already moving toward the valley. The leader's expression tightened. He had expected danger, but not this soon. The boy stepped forward and repeated her words in his own language, adding what he had witnessed. The warriors listened closely. Some looked ready to fight. Others looked weary, reminding her how long this tension had been building even before she arrived. She felt guilt rise inside her. If she had walked away in town that first day, maybe none of this would be happening. But the leader placed a hand on her arm. He said the blame was not hers. He said injustice had been rising long before she stepped forward. Her choice had not created the conflict, only revealed what already lived beneath the surface. His words eased her heart, but only a little warriors gathered around the leader, discussing what to do. The sound of horses carried faintly through the trees behind them. The soldiers were getting closer. She saw the fear in the younger warriors' eyes. They didn't want to abandon their home, their families, their ways. But they knew soldiers rarely came with peaceful intentions. She stepped forward and asked the leader if they could move deeper into the hills. She said if they left the clearing peacefully, the soldiers would find no battle to start. The leader considered her words, looking out at the dark ridges. He said retreat would be seen as weakness by some, but staying would risk lives. He needed a path that protected their dignity and their future. The young rancher from town suddenly appeared at the edge of the clearing, breathless and alone. The warriors pulled their weapons, but she recognized him and called out. He raised his hands quickly, saying he meant no harm. He had ridden ahead of the soldiers, following a side path, hoping to warn her. He said the sheriff had lost control of the situation. Some townspeople questioned the sheriff, but others were frightened enough to follow him without thinking. The rancher said the soldiers believed the tribe was preparing an attack. They were riding in fast, assuming the worst. The rancher begged her and the leader to avoid confrontation. He said his own family wanted peace. He said many settlers only wanted their children safe and didn't want a war touching their homes. The leader listened carefully. The rancher's honesty carried weight. The boy watched the rancher with cautious curiosity, recognizing him from the town square. The rancher looked at the boy and lowered his eyes, ashamed of the town's earlier silence. He apologized in a quiet voice, saying no one had stepped in when the boy was beaten. The boy stared at him for a long moment before giving a single nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. The leader made a decision. He told the warriors they would move deeper into the hills, but not as if they were running. They would move with honor, leaving clear signs that they did not seek a fight. He said they would circle around the ridge and position themselves where the soldiers could see the truth if they chose to. He asked the rancher to guide the soldiers toward the open clearing where they would find no threat. The rancher agreed, promising he would ride back immediately. He gave her a grateful look before disappearing into the trees again. With urgency but without panic, the Apache warriors mounted their horses. They moved in a calm, organized line, each rider holding himself with dignity. The young boy rode near the leader, glancing back at her often with a mixture of gratitude and worry. She stood beside the leader as the last riders gathered. He said she had done more than she knew. He said the valley would remember her courage. She felt her throat tighten. She asked what would happen now. The leader said peace was never simple, but today it had been protected. He said the tribe would camp in a higher valley for a time until things cooled, but they would not leave their homeland. This land held their ancestors, their stories, their identity. No sheriff or soldier could erase that. The boy rode closer and handed her a second woven charm, smaller than the first. He said it was a sign of strength, something she had shown more than many adults he had known. She held the charm gently, feeling its meaning settle inside her. The leader lifted his hand, signaling the start of their quiet retreat. The warriors moved with steady rhythm, disappearing one by one into the forest paths. The boy gave her one last look before vanishing into the trees. When the last rider slipped beyond the cottonwoods, the clearing felt suddenly wide and still again. She walked back to her cabin, the night air cool on her skin. She lit a lantern inside and placed the 2 woven charms on her table. Their simple beauty filled the small room with a sense of connection. For the first time in a long while, she felt she wasn't living alone. She felt tied to something bigger, something that stretched beyond fear and conflict. Moments later, distant voices and hoofbeats filled the valley. The soldiers arrived, guided by the rancher. She stepped onto her porch as lanterns glowed through the trees. The sheriff rode at the front with a hard expression, but the soldiers halted him before he could charge ahead. The army captain approached her first, asking what had happened. She explained everything, calmly and clearly, speaking of the tribe's peaceful retreat and the sheriff's misunderstanding. She did not accuse anyone, only described what she saw. The captain listened with care. He had seen enough conflict across the frontier to know truth when he heard it. He questioned the rancher, who confirmed her words. The sheriff grew red with frustration, insisting she was lying. But the captain noted the signs. There were no tracks of aggressive movement, no signs of an attack, no threat. Only a peaceful dispersal. The captain told the sheriff to stand down. The soldiers would not provoke a misunderstanding into a battle. The sheriff argued loudly, saying the tribe would return with more numbers. But the captain reminded him that his authority was limited and that the army's duty was peacekeeping, not fueling fear. The town riders watched this exchange with mixed expressions. Some relieved, some confused, some embarrassed that fear had pushed them toward conflict. The teacher stepped forward and thanked her quietly. The rancher's father approached and apologized for the panic. Slowly, the crowd softened. The sheriff, seeing the tide turn, stiffened and said he had only acted to protect the valley. But it was clear his influence had weakened. The next morning, the valley was quiet. Birds resumed their songs. Light settled calmly over the creek. She visited the place where the tribe had camped. Only faint hoofprints remained. She felt a sense of peace, knowing they were safe in the higher valleys and that she had played a role in preventing bloodshed. Days passed. People from town began stopping by her cabin, some bringing small gifts or supplies as thanks. The teacher came often, offering company and conversation. The rancher visited to ensure she had enough firewood and told her his family supported her courage. Even those who had doubted her seemed to soften when they saw she remained calm and steady. Weeks later, she found a woven basket near her door filled with herbs and dried berries. No one was in sight, but she knew who had left it. Attached to the handle was a small strip of bark with a symbol she recognized from the charms. It was the tribe's way of saying they were well. She held the basket close, grateful beyond words. The valley gradually returned to its rhythm. The sheriff, having lost standing in the town, became quieter, less confrontational. The townsfolk listened more, questioned more, and trusted less blindly. Peace was never perfect, but it was stronger than before. She continued her life on the frontier, tending her garden, fetching water, riding into town on quiet afternoons. Yet her world felt fuller now. She was part of something woven across cultures, something made from respect and courage. She carried the two charms with her often, reminders of the day she stood against fear and chose what was right. And whenever she looked out at the hills, she wondered when she might see the young Apache boy again, guiding his horse between the trees with the same steady determination. She hoped he carried strength from what they had faced together. She hoped the valley carried hope too. The frontier remained harsh and unpredictable, but the land held a story now of a woman, a tribe, a boy, and a valley that chose peace over fear. And in that choice lived a kind of quiet, lasting victory, a good ending, shaped by courage, kindness, and the strength to stand when standing mattered most.